NBC News and MSNBC. John Heilman, professor at Princeton University, columnist for Time Magazine, and author of the book Democracy in Black, Eddie Glaude Jr. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent and host of KCDC, where they play nothing but, wow, still no Dave Matthews Band. Casey Hunt. And joining the conversation, we have chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, Mark Leibovich, and political reporter for the Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst Robert Costa. He's the moderator, of course, of Washington Week on PBS. And Bob, let me start with you. Just about the craziness that happened this weekend. Yesterday, Omarosa'S on Meet the Press, and we find out there that she actually, after being taken into the Situation Room, records a conversation in there, which of course is one of many breaches that seem to occur in that White House every day. But the chaos continues. Here's somebody that Donald Trump's been close with for well over a decade, and she's claiming that he uses the N-word, claiming quite a few things. But again, the big takeaway that she's recording the conversation of the chief of staff as he's firing her in the Situation Room.
I was struck, Joe, by my conversation with a different range of sources on this. White House officials, people who are part of the Republican Party establishment, they're taken aback by what Ms. Manigault-Newman is doing with her book. They say she has no credibility. Yet when you call longtime friends of President Trump, people who've been at that 26th floor on Trump Tower and seen the kind of people coming in and out, seen then businessman Donald Trump shouting at his assistants for a Diet Coke, asking, threatening friends and enemies that they could be recorded. They've shrugged at this book in a sense. They say this is how it's always been in Trump world, a mix of celebrity, politics, ego, and business, and it continues today. It's the White House officials who don't really know what to make of it and are struck by it.
That haven't been, John Heilman, that haven't seen Donald Trump in action at Trump Tower. It's a sight to behold. But you now have, though, one of his longest TV partners in Omarosa, and also his fixer, his attorney fixer. Right. Both of them would record Donald Trump all the time. It's almost as if they knew, like Monica Lewinsky, that they had to preserve the evidence.
Yeah, people who've known Trump for a long time. These are people who are not new to him. They're people who, as Bob said, not just were familiar, have been in that office, but were familiar with the kind of modus vivendi, the modus operandi of Donald Trump as he moved through the world. I think that a lot of them recognize that the loyalty that they were expected to give to Donald Trump might not be returned to them fully in the future, and that they needed to have some kind of insurance policy against that. There are also people who were demonstrably trying, and again, this doesn't excuse anything about Donald Trump, but they are also, Michael Cohen's case and in Omarosa'S case, people who are trying to use their relationship with Donald Trump to try to profit one way or the other, either financially, reputationally, in terms of their status in the world. These are not people who were not self-interested. And so, again, you look at many of the things she says about Donald Trump come as news to no one. The notion that Donald Trump is a racist, that he says racist things. This is the furthest thing from breaking news in the world. But I think you look at her and you say that this is someone who was using Donald Trump just as Donald Trump was using her. The nature of the transaction was clear to both of them. The notion that she's claiming now, that she suddenly looked up very late in her time and realized that she was complicit in having given him racial cover. She knew from the very beginning that that's what she was there to do. This is not a stupid person. This is a person with maybe no conscience, no soul, and no ethics, but she's not a person with no brain. And she knew what her role was. She used it, she embraced it, and then when it was time to go, she's now taking advantage of the opportunity to cash in. And, is she laying bare some things about Donald Trump? She is. But none of them are news to anyone who's been paying attention over the course of the last couple of years.
So, Mark Leibovich, what always is a surprise to me, and I guess it shouldn't be a surprise to me because it keeps happening so much, is exactly the type of people who will do whatever Donald Trump wants them to do. And despite the fact they know that the story always ends badly. You always end up under the bus, and he will drive it forward and then drive it back, call you a low lie. You know, in your cover story, I guess several months ago on, you know, this town under Trump. My God, the faces and the names that have changed since then around the president, but they all go out the way the Steve Bannons of the world go out. There's never a happy ending. So why do people now like Rudy Giuliani? Why do they go on TV, embarrass themselves, and contradict themselves every 5 minutes when they know it always ends badly?
Well, there is certainly we've seen this movie before, quality to this. And I think in a lot of cases, maybe certainly in Omarosa'S case, it's not like she was going to get a job in any other White House. I mean, Donald Trump was the last shot for a lot of people. It was not, I mean, yeah. Michael Cohen was not going to be the lawyer for a future or current or former president anytime soon. Michael Flynn wasn't going to be a national security advisor. Paul Manafort wasn't going to be a campaign manager. So you see this pattern of desperation becomes jobs, becomes things that end very, very badly, either with some kind of public and unseemly feud like this, or indictments in the case of Manafort or Flynn and others. So, look, this is a very familiar story, but you do have to step back periodically, and every time it happens, you know, you have to try to and just say, wow, this is happening in the White House. This is not a two-bit operation anymore. This is our country.
Yeah, this is happening in the White House, and you look, I mean, that's a great segue to Rudy Giuliani. Let me show you a clip of Rudy Giuliani, show everybody, where he's contradicting himself yesterday, saying that President Trump and former FBI Director James Comey never talked about. Giuliani said they never talked about former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. But this, of course, comes after Giuliani and other Trump officials have said for a long time that the president did, in fact, talk about Flynn with Comey and said, hey, give him a break. This is what Giuliani said yesterday, and after that, we'll play the comments he made just a month ago.
What happened in that conversation with Comey about Michael Flynn? What exactly did President Trump say?
There was no conversation about Michael Flynn.
So you're saying that President Trump and James Comey never discussed Michael Flynn?
That is what he will testify to if he's asked that question. They already know that. So why are they asking us for him to repeat what they already know under oath?
And you're also saying that a month ago you didn't tell ABC News that he said something along the lines of can you give him a break?
No, I did not. I said that is what Comey says. The reality is Comey, in some ways, ends up being a good witness for us.
How is he a good witness for the president if he's saying that the president was asking him, directing him, in his words, to let the Michael Flynn investigation go?
He didn't direct him to do that. What he said to him was, can you give him a break?
Comey says he...
What he said was, what Donald Trump said was, can you give him a break? And yesterday, there you had Giuliani acting shocked and stunned and just baffled that anyone would suggest that Giuliani had said that before. Bob Costa, can you explain this to the outside world? how the stories change every 15 minutes, and you have Rudy Giuliani having to go out every 15 minutes and change his story like he did yesterday?
There's no explanation, Joe, but if you think about the context of all of this, Robert Mueller is finishing up his report on possible obstruction of justice by the president of the United States. He would like to get that report done based on our conversations with federal sources in the next couple of months before the midterm elections, if at all possible. To do that, he needs to know the president's intent. And public statements by Rudy Giuliani are not enough, and they're also confusing, as we just saw. And so the Mueller team wants to see what will the president say if he actually sits down in front of them talking to federal investigators. That's what matters, not these zigzagging statements by Mr. Giuliani.
Well, and how interesting is it, Casey, that you have Giuliani talking about Donald Trump not going into a perjury trap, which, of course, it's easy not to be put in a perjury trap, just tell the truth. And yet, you have Rudy Giuliani. It's almost like, he's sitting there, he's setting a trap for himself, stepping in it, walking 2 feet. But, I mean, Giuliani is contradicting himself all the time. I mean, this is just a White House that can't get a story straight.
In a way, Joe, that is clearly the strategy. I mean, this is not Giuliani contradicting himself by accident. I mean, they are very purposefully trying to offer up a narrative that helps them the most, and to a certain extent, you can see how this is suddenly, this gives us a window into those ongoing, negotiations between Giuliani and the special counsel's team, Giuliani and the broader legal team with Robert Mueller about this interview with the president. Suddenly, they realize this focus is very narrowly on this obstruction question that hinges on the he said, she said between James Comey and the president. James Comey has diaries. The president has an ever-evolving, changing story. The only way, as Bob just said, to get to the bottom of it is to talk to the special counsel. And I think, the one thing here is what we know, everything we know about Bob Mueller suggests that he is capable, eminently capable of keeping the main thing. So while Rudy Giuliani may be out there obfuscating, offering conflicting stories, I think it's pretty clear the special counsel is going about their business in a pretty straightforward way regardless.
Pretty straightforward way, and the contrast is really stunning and not good at all for the Trump team. It's because facts actually do matter with Robert Mueller and with his team and with the FBI and the Justice Department. So they better get a story and they better stick to it. Eddie, I said before, if you've ever been to Pensacola, Florida, and I know you have, if you go down 9th Avenue, you can go to Whataburger, and usually around lunchtime, there are more people waiting in line for a Whataburger on North 9th Avenue than there were at that rally yesterday in Washington, D.C. That was one of the most pathetic, one of the most sad, pathetic examples of a movement I've ever seen in my life. I'll be honest with you, Eddie, I was horrified by what I saw last year in Charlottesville, the torches and the mass crowds. And I said, what the hell? Where are these people? Is this Germany in 1933, 1934? Yesterday, boy, it was nothing but a whimper.
Absolutely. And the fact that taxpayers had to pay for it makes it all the more egregious, right? I mean, but I think it's important for us to understand at least two things. One, I think the public shaming of a lot of the folks who participated in the tragedy that was Charlottesville had an impact. I think there was a kind of general sense of outrage about that moment that had an effect on yesterday and on this weekend generally. But I do want to say this, that it doesn't mean that these white supremacist organizations have somehow become weaker. Many of them have gone underground. They've gotten stronger. We had a reporter from ProPublica on this show not too long ago, I think last week, who produced a documentary called Documenting Hate, showing us that these white supremacist organizations are getting stronger and they're getting more violent. So although yesterday was a sign of I think, the triumph of a more decent America, we shouldn't conclude that somehow the white supremacists have been pushed to the margins. As long as Donald Trump is fueling the fire, these folks will have a platform and an avenue to really hijack and derail our democracy.
Well, and that's really what you just touched on it. That's the difference between 2018 and 2008 or 1998. You've got a president of the White House who preaches moral equivalency between neo-Nazis and those who protest against neo-Nazis and puts out tweets that still just he can't bring himself to condemn violence that's been pushed by white supremacists. Right. He just won't do it. There's always a moral relativity, and he did it after Charlottesville, and of course he did it after this weekend. But the Trump administration is also dealing with the fact that Kellyanne Conway couldn't name a single senior African-American that is working in the West Wing right now. With us now, we've got NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker. Kristen, what's the administration telling you about a pretty remarkable failure on Kellyanne's part?
Well, look, Joe, they're pushing back. They're saying that Kellyanne made it very clear there are other African Americans who work within this administration who do have senior roles. Of course, Ben Carson being one example of that. But the bottom line is this exchange is making a lot of waves, getting a lot of attention. Take a look, and we'll do some analysis on the other side.
Kellyanne, the Omarosa was the most prominent high-level African-American serving in the West Wing on President Trump's staff. Who now is that person? Who is the most prominent high-level advisor to the president on the West Wing staff right now?
African-American?
Yes.
I would say that, well, first of all, you're totally not covering the fact that our Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and world-renowned
I'm asking you about the White House staff. I'm asking you about the people the president is with every day.
Well, the president works with Secretary Carson every day. He's trying to break the back of the scourge
who there is on the White House staff right now?
And we have Jerron, who's done a fabulous job and he's been very involved with Jared Kushner and President Trump on prison reform from the beginning. He's been there from the beginning. He worked with Omarosa and others.
So a lot of people wondering who Jerron is. Jerron is Jerron Smith. And according to administration officials, he has been working with another official here, Henry Childs, to really lead the African-American outreach. Now, they are not staffed here within the White House. They're in the EEOB. Bottom line, though, Henry Childs, someone on loan from the Commerce Department who's really taking the lead in terms of outreach to the African-American community, has had dozens of meetings with African-American leaders, I am told, also working on housing, urban development, taking a key role in the prison reform. Of course, that's something that Jared Kushner has been deeply engaged in. But again, when you ask that key question, who are the senior African-American officials based out of the West Wing, it is difficult, as you saw in that exchange there, to identify anyone. But again, this is a White House that is defiant and increasingly on defense in the wake of all of these allegations by former staffer Omarosa. Joe.
All right. NBC's Kristen Welker, thank you so much. Appreciate you being with us. Mark Leibovich, your article on Paul Ryan, it was remarkable, and people continue to talk about it. I've said here, I've known the guy since he was 22, and I've always I've just had the highest opinion of Paul as a person and as a legislator. But I don't really, I could have never predicted when I was excited about him becoming Speaker of the House. I could never have predicted that it would have ended this way, again, with a whimper, where he had a president just run over. I was talking to a member in the Republican caucus that just can't believe how he has subjugated himself to Donald Trump time and time again.
It is an interesting, it's a phenomenal sort of look into what happens when a idea person in the Republican Party. I mean, Paul Ryan has built himself for many, many years as someone who cares about policy. I'm a policy guy. I'm a PowerPoint guy. I'm someone who looks really deeply into what this means and fiscal conservatism and so forth. Just sort of has his career absolutely commingled with Trumpism. And so it's just such an imperfect and horrible and just really almost perverse to watch match, the two of them. And Ryan has really at every turn just sort of chosen not to fight. I mean, a lot of people have sort of used him as a vehicle for kind of Democratic, never Trump, even some quiet Republicans, some wish fulfillment, someone who's going to fight battles for them against Donald Trump. And he's sort of emblematic of a part of the Republican Party that really has no voice, certainly in the administration and certainly in Congress at the highest levels.
Yeah, but what I don't understand is I know that Paul always has seen himself more as a policy guy. He's not the type of guy that's going to get in and fight politically, and maybe he's just not good at the business of politics. Like Hillary Clinton said, my husband's great at politics. I'm not. It's not what I do. Maybe that's Paul Ryan, and I'm dead serious. Maybe he's a policy guy and he's bad at politics. The thing that I can't shake, though, is that he allows somebody like Devin Nunes to destroy the most bipartisan committee on the Hill, the House Ethics Committee, and lets Devin Nunes go around whispering about conspiracies to impeach Rod Rosenstein and to subvert the investigation into Putin, trying to subvert American democracy. How does Paul Ryan allow that to go on?
What's interesting is that Ryan has really two sets of defenses for what he has done over the last year and a half. One is he would say, look, if I had a argument, if I got into this back and forth with the president of the United States every day, it would be a distraction, no one would win, and we would get nothing passed at all in this Congress. I would lose my caucus. We would lose, 80% of our voters. And that's just not where the Republican Party is. And as the leader of the party in the House, I have a responsibility to represent that constituency. And the other part is that he would say that he has averted, and he literally said this to me, he has averted any number of tragedies privately. Tragedies was his word, which I was pretty struck by. He would say that I privately deal with the president. I privately try to shut things down in the House that people will never know about. And of course, I don't know what he's talking about. I mean, it's hard to prove a negative in this case. And like a number of other people who have worked in the White House, who have worked closely with this president, he has said that, look, you got to trust me on this. I have stopped it from being a lot worse. And at the end of the day, you have this sort of black hole of what exactly are they talking about? Do we have to wait for the history books to come out? And are we going to have the luxury of knowing what this is about? Or are they just making excuses at this point? But no, I mean, I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest criticism on Paul Ryan is that he's let the Devin Nuneses run wild through Congress. He's let the Freedom Caucus really drive a lot of the agenda as far as discrediting the Mueller investigation. And he hasn't been a stronger voice in trying to counteract what has been a lot of noise to come out of the Republican House caucus that has been, I think a lot of people in the caucus privately would say has been counterproductive.
And there's a good way, John Heilman, to make that stop. And you know how you do it? As Speaker of the House, you call Devin Nunes in and go, stop now. He hasn't done it.
No, he has not. And I'll say, Mark Leibovich and I think probably have had a similar experience because, over the course of from the time that there was a moment, you all remember in the 2016 campaign, when after the Judge Curiel incident happened, Paul Ryan stepped out and said that what Trump had done there in saying that this judge who was of Mexican ancestry could not rule fairly in his case on a Trump University case because of his ancestry, that he said there was a textbook definition of racism. That was a moment where people thought that Ryan, that kind of gave some kind of lit the notion, the flame that Ryan might be a counterweight to Donald Trump. And then you never saw anything like that again. And I've heard the same things that Mark has heard from people close to, from people close to the speaker who've said tragedies have been averted. You'll never know what he's done behind the scenes to stop worse things from happening. And every time, not just asking the speaker himself, but asking people close to him who care about his reputation, saying, tell me on background, tell me off the record. Give me an example, something to make me believe that that's true. I've not heard one example on background, on deep background, or off the record. And I don't know if, Mark, if you have had a contrary experience, but I continue to sit here on television today and say to the many people I know who are close to Paul Ryan, who believe that in some way he's still a good man, and who maintain that what he has said to Mark Leibovich in this story is true, the tragedies have been averted, please, just so I can believe if they're there, call me. I'd be happy to hear, even off the record, one example of a tragedy that's been averted because of Paul Ryan's private efforts on Donald Trump. I have searched, and I've asked before, and I've not heard one single example so far, but I remain open to the idea that it's possible.
Yeah, Bob Cost, you've covered the White House, you've covered the Hill. You certainly have covered this relationship between Donald Trump and Paul Ryan, and it seems to be a relationship that just goes one way. The president threatens Paul Ryan, and Paul Ryan backs down. Is Paul Ryan going to be the face of this House Republican Party when the history of Trumpism is written?
He is. He's going to be the face of the Republican Party. And after reading Mark's excellent piece, I kept coming to the word why. Why did this play out with Speaker Ryan like it did? And I kept coming to that word in Mark's story, policy, the policy guy, self-described policy guy. Why didn't Ryan have the clout in 2016 at the moment John mentioned, even now in 2018? He lost the policy fights that candidate Trump and now President Trump has won. He made a case on immigration in the 90s and in the 2000s to try to be much more open border and moderate Republican on immigration. He lost that fight. He lost the push for reform on Social Security and Medicare within his own party. Who steps in? This raw, anger-motivated politician in Donald Trump. And Ryan lost those policy battles, which didn't give him the real power he needed to counter the kind of force that Donald Trump was and has become.
Yeah, Paul Ryan and Donald Trump, protectionists as well. Robert Costa, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Mark Leibovich, thank you as well. And still ahead on Morning Joe, what does Sunday's Unite the Right rally tell us about the state of the alt-right?
On those biases to bring people closer to their side. So you see them talk about Black Lives Matter a lot.
Yeah.
And that's really important because you're not talking about, you know, some imaginary remote rural Southerner, right? You're talking about people in the cities, people where wealthy people live, people where places where liberals live, right? That strikes at the heart of liberal power. And that is a much more powerful appeal to like mainstream people.
Yeah, Casey Hunt's with us and has a question. Casey?
Hey, Ellie, the one thing that has been sort of observed in the wake of Charlottesville, Politico did a long story about how there was tremendous backlash to the events, obviously, but also to the president and how he handled the events at that time. There were business CEOs who walked away, who said that they weren't going to associate with the president any longer. But over the course of the last year, the president has continued to make racially tinged remarks, to put it mildly. And sort of one by one, quietly, a lot of those thought and opinion and business leaders have found their way back to engaging with the president. He had many of them over to dinner in Bedminster just last week, over the weekend. Is there, in your view, kind of a material difference 1 year later? Have we as a country grappled with this and refused to forget it, or has it kind of drifted away?
I think most people don't forget it. Most people still see this as an evil that we don't want to infect our culture. But white nationalists talk about something they call shifting the Overton window, which means they want to shift the parameters of the political debate so that what was once forbidden becomes fringe and what was fringe becomes mainstream. And so they see themselves like pulling their once totally forbidden ideas to be a little bit more fringe. You know, so Donald Trump will condemn all racism, you know, and the idea there is that he's also condemning racism against white people, wherever that might be.
Right. Let me just ask you a very straightforward, very pointed question, right? So you were there last before the horror in Charlottesville last year. You're now back. You talk to these people who are members of the white nationalist movements, neo-Nazi movements. Do they believe Donald Trump has their back a year later?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, Chris Cantwell, he was getting very angry at me for trying to ask him about were there any links between the alt-right and the Republican Party. He starts yelling at me, right? The entire time, he's got his own flag of Donald Trump's face right behind him, leaning over his shoulder. They like Donald Trump not just for the racial politics, but also for the attitude, the idea that he doesn't mind making people angry. Another catchphrase among them was womp womp, after Corey Lewandowski used that phrase to refer to children being separated from their parents at the border.
And Donald Trump gets positive tweets adding from, of course, none other than David Duke. It's really eye-opening. And Vice News tonight on HBO is going to be airing Monday through Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Make sure you catch it. Ellie Reeve, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
And coming up, the ACLU is leading the charge in holding the government accountable for its policy of separating children from their parents. We're going to get an update on the number of families still broken and what the group is doing about it. Morning Joe, we'll be right back. Hey, welcome back to Morning Joe. John?
Yeah, Joe, speak to me. I'm just curious. I wrote today in the Washington Post about how if sort of an alternative history, what if FDR had been warned of a coming attack on Pearl Harbor throughout all of 1941? Right. The Democrats had a chance, knowing this, to vote for a stronger defense in the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. And then you had the chairman of the Armed Services Committee privately telling constituents that he was working to fire the generals who were actually talking about this looming threat. Not sure, but I think we would probably call them traitors. None dare call what Republicans today are doing treason. But that said, the forensic evidence is so overwhelming. At this point, how could the president call Putin's plans to interfere with U.S. democracy a hoax when the U.S. military has provided, and the intel community has provided all of that evidence in black and white? Yeah, Joe, I read your column, and it's funny. It in a weird way rhymes with the discussion we were having earlier about Paul Ryan with Mark Leibovich, and it raises you're kind of positing an alternative history and raising questions about what that would imply, and then carrying it forward to today. It raises the question we keep coming back to again and again, which is, what are these people thinking? And I ask you about it always because you spent many, many years in this party, and for a long time were a card-carrying member of it. Now, not so much. Right. But in the end, what are they thinking?
I can't imagine it because, again, you had the United States military people working at Fort Meade. You had our intel community. You have Dan Coates. You had Kirstjen Nielsen. You had Trump's own appointed FBI director. You had everybody that Donald Trump has appointed saying that, Kirstjen Nielsen, of all people, said, our democracy is directly in the crosshairs of Vladimir Putin. Our democracy is being threatened. Dan Coates, Donald Trump's director of national intelligence, tells the press and the world that the warning signs are blinking, and this reminds him of the months leading up to September 11th. So if you're a Republican and you're hearing all of these Republican appointees saying Vladimir Putin and Russia, they've attacked the United States of America in the past and they're planning another attack now, what's your legacy, John, if you sit back and not only do nothing but try to end that investigation?
I don't. It's hard to imagine that history will look kindly on any of these people, especially if the worst that is now being forecast and the worst that we fear actually comes to pass, whether it's in the next 3 or 4 months or whether it's ahead of the 2020 elections.
Yeah, all right. Well, coming up next, there are plenty of secrets surrounding the Russia investigation, and the judge overseeing Paul Manafort's trial knows a lot of them. We're going to be talking about the latest developments in that case with the former prosecutor who's been ringside in the courtroom, and it's gotten wild in there. Morning Joe coming back in a moment. So with us now, former prosecutor with the Eastern District of Virginia, Gene Rossi. He previously tried cases before the judge presiding over the trial of Paul Manafort. Judge T.S. Ellis, who, as the New York Magazine points out, is among the handful of judges in the country who know some of the deepest secrets of the Russia investigation. Thanks so much for being with us, Gene. I guess the first question I have to ask is, what's with Judge Ellis's deep antipathy for the prosecution? It seems to come out just about every day in the courtroom.
Are you still not hearing Joe?
Not hearing.
Joe, we have a little bit of an audio problem, so I'm going to translate your question to Gene. Joe's basic question is, so what's the deal with this judge? He seems to be exhibiting a hostility towards the prosecution, seems to be putting his thumb on the scale. There's been a lot of discussion of that. What's your view about whether or not that is the case?
Well, let me tell you how I know Judge Ellis. I appeared in front of him for 20 years. I had 20 trials, 7 trials, and I had hundreds of hearings. And here is the scoop on Judge Ellis. He is not a potted plant.
Clearly. Clearly not.
He's very active. He wants to be engaged.
Yeah.
He's not a judge that's going to sit back.
Yeah.
That's who he is, and he's
Right.
never going to change.
Yeah.
Let me address how he's putting his thumb on the scale. This is sort of like a football game. 2 weeks ago, that first week, Judge Ellis was indeed putting his thumb on the scale, in my opinion. Very hard on both prosecutors, all three prosecutors, whom I know well. That was the first week. This past week, things changed a little bit. He's pulling back on his criticism, his interjecting, and I think at the end of last week, I wouldn't say it was affection, but the warmth, relative warmth he showed the prosecution's case seemed to evolve a little bit, and here's why. Based on my times in front of him and my trials and my hearings, I think he now gets this case. He now sees the big picture, what I call the final mosaic. And as I said before the camera came, I have done 30 tax trials. I have never seen more greed, lies, and manipulation in a tax trial than I have seen in this one. It is off the charts. On a scale of 1 to 10, on greed, a 13. Lies, 11. Manipulation, 12. It's unbelievable. I think Judge Ellis now has pulled back his interjecting in the case. And in fact, he sort of apologized a couple days ago when the prosecutors were reminding him that he did not exclude a certain witness.
Right.
It wasn't a full-fledged apology, but coming from Judge Ellis, that's an apology.
So you see the way Judge Ellis is behaving. What do you make of how the prosecutors are pursuing the case, where they place Gates and the kind of case that they're putting on?
I did 100 trials, so what you do is you try to place your witnesses strategically. And I got to compliment the prosecutors here and the defense attorneys. The defense attorneys are doing a great job with what they have. The prosecutors started off with documents and verbal testimony, Heather Washkoon, Philip Aliff, Cindy Laporta, and others. And then they followed it and put Gates on Monday of last week. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And I watched and observed Gates' testimony. I'd love to talk about that. That was a brilliant placement of Rick Gates because after he testified, he corroborated in part all what the other witnesses said and the documents. And now, these last few days, we've been bank fraud, bank fraud, bank fraud. That's document driven. And now we get into Stephen Calk and the Federal Savings Bank, the Yankee tickets. You know, we're almost forgetting that Rick Gates testified. We're now focusing on the bank fraud. I thought their timing of their witnesses in a sequence was brilliant.
You just said you wanted to talk about Gates' testimony. Talk about that.
Let's talk about that. I thought Rick Gates' direct exam by the prosecutor was outstanding. Outstanding. He corroborated everything that the government theory is asking the jury to believe. And I want the folks on watching this show to focus on one exhibit that sort of encapsulates who Rick Gates is. This is Government Exhibit 391. It's an email from Paul Manafort, March 16, 2016, to Rick Gates. And Paul Manafort says, Rick, you are the quarterback, quote unquote. That is the theory of this case. Rick Gates was indeed the quarterback, but who was calling the plays? Coach Paul. And I'm not talking about Paul Bear Bryant, I'm talking about Paul Manafort. That email is devastating. And Rick Gates' testimony and the documents corroborated that email. Now let's talk about Cross by Kevin Downey. And I said the defense attorneys are doing a great job with the hand dealt them. Kevin Downey did a fantastic job. He got in some jabs. But the problem is he didn't get in enough jabs. He didn't knock Rick Gates out. And on redirect by the prosecutor, he brought the jury back to the core of Rick Gates' testimony, which is, I was his quarterback He called the plays.
Gene, we gotta leave it there. I gotta say to Joe, thank you very much for your wisdom on this. Joe, it sounds like Gene is not, definitively not in the category of those who think that the prosecution is in any trouble, despite some of the judges' thumb on scaling, and despite
Yep.
some of the Rick Gates testimony that seemed to not go particularly well from him. One bad day of testimony. It seems like it looks like, from this point of view, at least from where Gene sits, still a slam dunk for the prosecution on this case.
We shall see. That's been the assumption for some time, and a lot of, often in these trials that the media cover, you have that assumption going in, and then there are surprises once in a while. We'll see if it happens here. Well, still ahead, the Trump team wants Bob Mueller to wrap his investigation up, but how could that be possible when they keep providing more and more potential evidence of obstruction? Plus, Ivanka Trump said she wanted to be a force for good in the White House. We're going to be talking to columnist Margaret Carlson about whether the first daughter and presidential advisor is living up to that ideal. Morning Joe is coming right back.